Good afternoon. Welcome to UCSF Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, chair of the department. And thank you for joining us today. We are aware that the chancellor is doing his State of UCSF address at the same time. That's being taped. You can watch that later, as is this. So we're glad that you've chosen to join us. Those of us who are watching later, that's great as well. It's a very special Grand Rounds for us today because we have one of our most esteemed colleagues who is coming back to join us. So last year, our own Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo was named the 17th editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. As everybody around here knows, Kirsten's a general internist, a cardiovascular epidemiologist, and a leader in prevention and interventions to reduce healthcare disparities. She's used a number of methods over the course of her career, including observational studies, pragmatic studies, modeling, to look at various policy interventions and their impact on health and healthcare. Previously, she was the inaugural Vice Dean for Population Health and Health Equity in our School of Medicine, and for a number of years, chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. She co-founded our Center for Vulnerable Populations and has really been an essential citizen at UCSF for a few decades. She's an elected member of all the key national societies, the American Society of Clinical Investigation, the AAP, the National Academy of Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was chair of the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force. Basically, she's done everything in medicine, and we're proud to have her as a member of the UCSF family, and also proud that she is now has this role, which is really one of the most important roles in medicine in the world, not just in the United States. So the format here will be a Q&A. I will have a bunch of questions for Kirsten, and then if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. As always, closed captioning is available. We will post this on YouTube later. CME's available if you're interested to stay on at the end. And so with that, let us see if we can get Kirsten back on. There you are. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, why don't you start off with any sort of opening observations or thoughts in this sort of funky version of a return to UCSF? I know you still practice at the county a couple times a month, so you're still here. You're still on our faculty, which is wonderful. But give some opening thoughts, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Well, I first of all, it's a real pleasure to be back and talking with you. I think I did my first fireside chat with you when I started as chair of Epidemiology and Biostatistics and as vice dean, and that was about 5 years ago. And then a transition to this role July 1st, which is a very different role. I have spent my entire life at UCSF, my entire professional life at UCSF. I am the embodiment of "you can stay forever" is what UCSF stands for. But UCSF has a very special place in my heart. It's where I've learned sort of all of the sets of things that got me to this point, which is in a very different job. You invited me to come and talk about this right after I took this job, and I said, invite me back when I know a little bit more. So I'm 4 months in, and I know just a little bit more, but I'm really happy to talk with you all today.
Well, that's great. Thank you. So let's talk about sort of taking the job and sort of that process first, and then we'll get into some of the issues of the day, which are many. When did you first learn you were even being considered for it, and what was your initial thought about the possibility? It's such a departure from what you've been, obviously, you've been writing for JAMA and other publications. We all know the journal world, but it's such a different kind of job than the ones you've had. So tell me about that early process.
Yeah, I like to say I've spent my entire professional life trying to get into JAMA, but have never thought about working on the other side. I've never been an editor. I will say that communicating about science to other scientists, to a broad clinical community, to the general public has always been very important to me. And I think during the pandemic, you, like many physicians, really took to heart how important it was to be able to communicate effectively. And it became a very important issue for me during the pandemic. And the pandemic is the great disruptor. And I think when this job came open, I sort of applied on a whim. I frankly didn't think that they were going to like me, and I didn't think I was going to like them. And at each stage in the process, I figured I would just, do what what's important to me, what I think I have to offer. And as we got deeper in the interview process, it became clear to me that this really is quite an extraordinary opportunity that comes at a really interesting time when I had the energy and the passion to do something more in this space related to communication of science. And so that's how I ended up when they made me the offer, saying yes. That offer was a lot easier to accept because UCSF also allowed me to remain part of the UCSF family.
Great. So you took over partly in the context of something of a scandal, and or at least an issue that led to the changing of the guard, which was around racial insensitivity. I get there's a lot of different ways we can frame it, but clearly at least that. As you started, what did you think job one was, and how did the fact that you were starting in that context, as opposed to the last editor just stepping down after a long tenure, how did that influence your thinking about kind of your early goals?
Yeah, so very interesting. So I think the issues of equity, of understanding how we in medicine, in publishing, create equitable work environments, communicate with an understanding of the important equity issues in science and in medicine. It's one that's, those issues are, many institutions are having to wrestle with them, need to be wrestling with them. And I don't think JAMA is unique by any means. As an organization, by the time I had arrived, we were already a year from that event. And as an organization, the AMA and JAMA in particular had already done a lot to sort of think through what needed to change internally, think through how important that was to both processes internally as well as how we communicate externally, what it looks like in terms of the composition of the workforce, the workplace environment. And so a lot of that work had already been done. And frankly, that's part of the reason why I felt it would be a good time to be in a strong organization that had already done some of the thinking on this issue. But I also felt there was more I could also bring to the table. And I think that's what we are in the process of sort of continuing to do, that internal work, as well as do the external work, because again, this isn't an issue that is unique to JAMA. This is an issue that we're all faced with in science and medicine.
Mm-hmm. So were there things that you felt like you had to do, assuming taking over the reins, both for internal constituencies and for external constituencies, to communicate sort of what you're about, communicate the regain trust among various groups? And if so, did you have intentional strategies that you then executed to do that?
Well, I would say our organization had already started on that. So a very visible example was we're 13 journals within the JAMA network of journals. Each of the editorial teams at each of the journals had already appointed a deputy editor who was part of the formal editorial structure, but had a specific focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. The JAMA team had hired an editor right as the time I was coming on to sort of coordinate all of those efforts. So there was already a lot that the organization had done visibly. I think for me, certainly, the symbolism of me coming on to take over as the editor-in-chief of this organization is not lost on many people. I'm only the second woman in nearly 150 years in this journal to have this role, the first person of color to have this role. So with that, there is that sort of symbolic step. there are the steps that had led up to me taking this job and were already in place in terms of more data collection, commitment to diversifying the composition of our editorial boards, of our editorial teams. Those had already been written about before I'm here. I think a lot what I've brought is really just a different perspective, a perspective as somebody who's mostly lived my life at a university, thinking about how we talk to people early on in their medical careers about these issues, a commitment from a university like UCSF that has a strong commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and sort of a different view. Publishing is sort of a different world than academic medicine. And in many ways, I think that it's very easy for smaller shops like this to become somewhat insular. And I would say if you look across at the composition of medical and scientific publishing across the country, across the globe, it is still a pretty insular shop. And so sometimes I think what I've brought is just a different pair of eyes on the existing structure and how we might do things a little bit differently.
How does the insularness, I think, probably partly comes from the fact that you're smallish, but also everybody wants something from you. And It probably feels like when going to run a foundation as well, like you spent your entire life trying to hit them up for something, and now you are the hittee, not the hitter. So how do you prevent being insular and sort of in some ways creating a fence around you because everybody who's talking to you sort of wants to be in your journal?
Yeah, I think you've hit on a very important point. Not only does everyone want to be in the journal, but the entire nature of peer review, of setting up a process where I'm reviewing your paper through this internal process. I get a set of peer reviewers to also do that, who you don't know who they are. There's a lot about the integrity of the process that necessitates being a little bit distant, there being a little bit of distance between the author and the journal. On the other hand, and I think that is that, and plus not being sort of at a larger institution, one that has trainees and new people coming into an institution all the time. I think all of those lend themselves to journals being a little bit insular. On the other hand, if you think about what our goals are, an author wants their science to be vetted fairly, wants it then to be published well so that people can read it and then disseminate it as broadly as possible. And to the extent that that's the author's goals, that's our goal as a journal as well. And so I sort of feel like we are more aligned, and that this divide between authors and journals doesn't really have to be that way. We have to preserve the integrity of the process, but really we do have the shared goals of doing this. And I think in this environment where you have more people talking about open science, open access, about time to publication, about our competitors being preprint servers and other types of things, that means that as journals, we also have to recognize that we have a role to play. The peer review process is an essential part of why people have confidence in the science we publish. But the partnership is also key to our process. We have shared goals of getting accurate information out quickly to as broad a possible audience, and that we share with an author, and we should be doing everything we can to do that together.
We'll get back to some of the preprint stuff in a few minutes. I have to say, I often feel a little more aligned when JAMA takes what I sent them than when they reject it, but that's maybe me. So,
the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Eric Rubin, said to me soon after I took this job, he says, "Oh, being an editor is a great way to make friends until you reject people's papers."
Of course. Talk a little bit about the relationship with the AMA. You know, you are you're in a smallish entity, but within a very large entity that has, I assume, something of a firewall and yet something of a relationship. And also, I'll sort of say contextually and brag slightly that the AMA president is now another member of our faculty, Jack Resnick. So that there's that. So talk a little about the relationship. Has anything about it surprised you as you've come to understand it?
No, I think you're right. So I am an employee of the AMA, and JAMA is the journal of the American Medical Association. But the firewall is also important because it is critically important that there is editorial independence, and that is prized. And I think the firewall, we have a governance structure that really preserves that firewall between JAMA and the AMA. And I think that serves a purpose both for JAMA and frankly for the AMA. I'm really, I've been both pleasantly surprised in how well this firewall works, how well it works for both sides. And I think if you were interviewing the CEO of the AMA, he would say the same thing. I mean, it's to his advantage if somebody is complaining that he says, well, there's a firewall, and I think it works very well. Those of you who might know the history of how these firewalls develop, there have been editors who've been let go in the past because of when these types of firewalls don't exist or operate in the way that they're intended to function. And so I do think it's a critically important, and I'm really pleased to say I think it works very well here.
So as you feel like you need to get into a hot button issue because it's important for health and public health, call it abortion, call it guns, call it whatever, does it cross your mind how this is going to play, I don't know, down the hall, 5 floors up, I don't know, wherever the office is compared to the corporate offices of the AMA? Do you vet it at all, or it's like, I'm free to run with this, but I kind of know that the history is there have been a few people that have been fired over the years for sort of misstepping in these areas. How do you process this? Because it must happen all the time.
Yeah, I mean, we really do have a firewall. There quite literally is a firewall. And so we recently had a theme issue Tuesday this week, a theme issue on healthcare access and reproductive rights. We earlier had a cluster issue on gun violence. That content is all developed on the JAMA side of the house. We everything about the editorial process is both separate early on from the publisher even of the, and so there is that division between editorial and publishing, but certainly from the AMA. And I think that it allows us to take on issues that we think are important for science and medicine, and not to worry that somehow the AMA is going to think about its members who might be concerned about this. And I do think it's important for us to be able to do that. We both sides of the house take it pretty seriously. And so, I think it works well.
Great. Yeah. In taking the job, you're sort of running a big business. You're also choosing content, and most of the content obviously is things that you directly or indirectly choose. And then there's this other thing, which is your own personal voice. You are writing a commentary, or you're going out and giving a talk. How did you think about the balance between those things, and how important is it to you, or has it felt to you, for you to be kind of a spokesperson for the things that you think are really important in the world of health and healthcare?
Yeah, this is an issue I've been thinking a lot about this week. I think, as I said, I hadn't been an editor before. And so coming in, I really felt my first job was to find my feet. And I think then the question is, how do you find your voice? I think for me, probably because I start as a scientist, my first instinct on how the journal plays a role in this area is to basically try to concentrate the scientific information in certain areas that I think are important, right? There is the whole range of interesting science that's being produced, but part of what we wanted to do, for example, in the theme issue on healthcare access and reproductive rights, is we knew that there were groups who had been thinking about the impacts of these recent changes in the laws and the impact on access to abortion services. And we wanted to be able to highlight the issue and its impact on how clinicians and patients interact, how clinicians can care for patients, but to do that by concentrating the scientific information in a way that people have that all together. So that's my first instinct on how to do this. But I think you quickly realize that because you're the editor-in-chief of a very large journal and a set of journals, that there's certainly other ways that I can use my personal voice to do that. I think you'll see that over time, some of which related to communication generally, and what does it mean to communicate with integrity? What does it mean for journals to communicate with integrity? But I do think over time you'll see that you'll see a little bit more. I don't think it's useful, or I don't want to speculate on whether it's useful. I would say it's probably not my style for me to weigh in on every single issue, because I don't think everybody really wants to know my opinion on every single issue. There are a few issues that are important to me, and I do think over time, as I find my footing, as the journal continues to publish science, which it's its first job, I will continue to do a little bit more on using my voice on the issues that are important to me.
As you mentioned, the journal has over 100-year tradition and history that inevitably is fantastic, and inevitably also makes it a little bit hidebound. And most institutions that are that old and storied, have traditions and cultures and processes that need to be modernized. So when you came in, how did you think about that, sort of preserving what's great, but also not being afraid to tackle some things that may involve substantial change?
Yeah, I came in and I had very good advice, I have to say, from people who basically said, you're not people in publishing, but people who said, don't miss this opportunity. You have a lot of experiences. You're bringing a lot to the table. Don't miss the opportunity to think about what could be better. This job was an easy one to take because it's not a fixer-upper job. It's a job of something moving pretty well, right? This is a journal and a set of journals that turned on a dime during the pandemic, from being really fully in person to never missing an issue to publishing, to having, a major disruption with the departure of the prior editor and keeping going. So things are working really well here. But that doesn't mean we can't, challenge some assumptions of why we do things. And that's basically what I've asked our team to do, is say, I would really like to know why we do things. It's pretty easy for me to ask that, because oftentimes I don't actually know why we're doing this. But that also helps the team and us to figure out, well, why are we doing this? Should we do it in a different way? One of my big priorities is really, and as we talked about earlier, is to think first about our authors and our readers. And so I want everybody on our team to say, well, how does this relate to the author's experience of publishing with us? Why do they choose to publish with us? What do our readers consume? Our readers are our clinicians, but they're also the general public. As you know, the readership audience is getting younger all the time, as it turns out, or we're getting older.
I think we're getting older. Sure. I think they're the same.
But what does that mean, and how people consume media? As you know, Bob, clinicians get information in all sorts of ways, on Twitter, through press releases, through other types of things. How do we stay relevant in this environment without preserving what's the best about this great historical institution, but also adapting to the consumption patterns of the time? And that means challenging, what's the core about what we do that we preserve, and how do we think differently in a different different environment. And I think the great thing is everyone's been very receptive to these ideas. There's a lot of energy behind it, and I think it's good, and it almost puts us in an ideal situation, especially because as an organization we had already built this great network of journals across the subspecialties. We already have 2 open access journals, and there's a lot of opportunity now to think in more innovative ways to adapt to a new environment about how people consume information.
And it sounds like you've given a lot of thought to audience. I would have thought 20 years ago, if I was publishing JAMA, my audience is doctors mostly, and a little bit of advertisers because we have to pay the bills, and but not the lay public, and maybe a little bit of the media. Like to get one of our articles in the Times or something, but I would not have thought about the lay public as being a major audience. I assume you think about that a lot now. And then, so if so, how do you balance that? Because the same content may be accessible for one group and not accessible for the other. And if you make it too accessible for the other, you may be having it sort of below the level of scientific rigor or the language that would be best for a practicing doctor or a scientist.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I hope you'll help me answer that question over time. That's one of the things we're really wrestling with. Even if you take our core audience, right? If you ask an author who's publishing the latest clinical trial what they want us to give them the full opportunity to describe their methods, to get the main finding out for a regulatory agency or to change clinical practice, to other scientists to do the next experiment, and we should get it out in the full amount of pages it takes to actually communicate that information as quickly as possible. That might not be the same way a practicing clinician wants to consume that same piece of information, which might be essential to how they change practice, but they may not want to go in depth in the methods section, right? So even if you take our core audience, right, let's say academic community, people who might be authors as well as a practicing clinical community, they are going to consume even what we have right now in slightly different ways. Mm-hmm. I'm always amazed at people who tell me, "Oh, I love your podcast of your summary of the issue because I don't have time to read JAMA, but I love the summary that you do in the podcast." And I, frankly, before doing this, I was like, I had no idea people actually listen to podcast summaries of journals, but a lot of people apparently do. And that's the core audience. And then, it turns out that obviously to have an impact on health, which is what we all want to ultimately do, there are a lot of stakeholders, right? There is the lay public. There are the patient advocacy groups who want the patient page that really communicates one particular thing, the explainer video that tells you, oh, what does this mean and how does it relate to this? Those being able to communicate across those other different medium to lay public and to like policymakers or to healthcare leaders who are one step removed, I think requires really being much more strategic about the different ways we think about our content beyond what's between the written pages of JAMA, which is how we've started. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really, tricky problem. It seems like many journals, including yours, have sort of decided to do it, not so much modifying the core content, but then repurposing the core content in different forms for different audiences. And it sounds like you think that's working well.
I think repurposing is the most clear thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. Because we invest most of our energies into this wonderful peer review process and vetting the science, and so being able to take that science and then the other viewpoints and reviews, and then repurpose it with content that can be consumed by a broader audience is core. But I think you'll increasingly see that the role of JAMA is to communicate about issues related to health. And sometimes that's very specifically tied to a scientific article. But sometimes it might be tied to something that is very important for health, that there might be a series of articles we published over time, or they're just the most important issue that we think there needs to be communication on. I think if you look at JAMA's role during the pandemic, you see that front and center. I think what JAMA did very well early on in the pandemic is to really engage with, through live streaming and through other sort of very immediate types of platforms, to hear from Tony Fauci and others, like, what was really going on? Like, how are we thinking? How are we thinking in the moment? That's not related to a specific article that's peer reviewed, but it is helping a lot of people, clinicians, patients, others, to think in a more up to the minute way about how are different leaders thinking about a topic. And so that's why I do think we have to explore all of these types of medium.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that when you were selected, you were the second woman editor, first editor of color of JAMA. What kind of special obligation does that give you? Or as you think about sort of you symbolize something important, you have people looking to you as a role model in ways that might not be the same if you were a different person. Do you think about that? Or is that I'm just going to do my job as well as I can and we'll see how things go?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it, but I've decided that the only way I get through my busy day is just to do the things that come naturally to me and instinctually to me. You know, it turns out training at UCSF, and being a faculty at UCSF, so and being at an institution that has thought about how we create a diverse and equitable environment. I think that's it's not. I think of it as being sort of embedded in sort of everything that we do, and it's everyone's responsibility. It's not mine uniquely because of who I am. Mm-hmm. I do think that there are. I've always. My favorite thing about being a faculty member is being able to talk to people early in their careers, to sort of demystify some parts of the academic process, to demystify some of parts of the in this case now, the publishing process. I do think you'll see the things that we'll be doing over the next year will be a lot more training opportunities, a lot sort of demystifying what that peer review process looks like, because that is in fact the way we draw more people into the peer review process. And frankly, we need more peer reviewers. We need peer reviewers with a broad range of expertise. We need people on our editorial teams. You'll see us having editorial teams that look a little bit more like people sitting as faculty members. We've all learned during the pandemic, you can work remotely. It turns out it works. Yep. And we want people who are part of our editorial teams who might be sitting full-time at another institution, but spend a substantial fraction of their time. I think that's another way for us to be part of the networks of academic communities that really is where we draw most of our authors from. And it also increases the pool from which we can draw. And I think that that is both what we have to do, I think, to say relevant and to have the best people on the team. It's also, I think, is what keeps us from becoming fully insular, frankly. And so I think those are aligned. But mostly I'm just trying to get through the day and make decisions the way I'd like to get
all your check boxes checked and keep your emails manageable.
Exactly.
You mentioned the peer review process. It's sort of almost a throwaway line that the peer review process is broken, and there's usually then 5 complaints about it. Do you think the peer review process works well, and are there ways where it needs to be modernized?
Yeah, the peer review process needs to be modernized. But do I think that it means that traditional journals are dead and the preprint servers is the only thing, and that millions of comments on a preprint server is a substitute for that? I don't think that's the case either. If I had to ask, and it's one of my UCSF colleagues who told me this, she says, she and I we published together, and she, like I, recognized the value of preprint servers and recognized the value of other platforms to engage in scientific conversation. But what she says is, the thing that ultimately changes practice still is that stamp of approval. It's like getting the information out early is good, but the stamp of approval that, well, a few people have looked at this who really are experts in this field, and they've sent it out to other people to look at this, and that those are the things that help guideline makers and the people who adopt the synthesis of the best evidence that ultimately are the things that oftentimes do change practice. They really do want that seal of approval. So the peer review process is not perfect, and we all should continue to think about how we improve it. It's not perfect, I would say, even frankly, from the perspective of a peer reviewer and an author. But the process of vetting scientific studies, especially as they move to clinical practice and where they have implications more quickly for clinical practice, that is important and will always need to be maintained. And it's probably the thing that I think gets lost in all the discussion about open access and open science and things like that, which is really driven a lot by the basic scientists and the people who are doing more fundamental scientific work, where the issues of getting results out quickly and getting the conversation about the results underway quickly is really important. What I know from being on both sides of the issue here for clinical publications is when people are trying to use that finding to make a decision about patients, you do want a few more steps in the process to say, no, really, this is not only a true scientific finding, but here are the implications for clinical practice.
But it sounds like you think that the preprint thing has net been positive. Am I putting words in your mouth, or do you think the world's a better place because it exists?
Oh, yeah, I do. I do. I don't think any of us, so there are plenty of people who work with traditional journals who think we should just get rid of preprint servers, even if we let a paper into our journals, like we should make them take them off the preprint servers. I'm definitely not in that camp. I think during the pandemic, it just sealed the deal that there is an important part of getting information out quickly. And there's an important part of having a sort of a rich scientific dialogue openly about a publication. But I do think the process of vetting, especially as you go through for research that you want to translate quickly into clinical practice, to traditional journals in doing that. And so I think the scientific ecosystem has plenty of room for both. And I think, frankly, traditional journals can learn from the preprint servers, which I think exist primarily because we have to get information out more quickly. And so I think the pressure from the preprint servers that I feel is that we need to figure out how to make our peer review process be consistently rigorous, but a little bit quicker.
Got it. I assume the preprints are one source of pressure. You mentioned some advice from the editor of the New England Journal. Do you wake up in the morning and sort of look at the New England Journal and say, how do we compete better? You don't have to answer that, but I wondered.
Well, this is a competitive environment, right? So it's friendly competition, frankly. I actually believe in strong scientific publications, and I have a lot of respect and watch our peer journals on how they're communicating, what they're doing, how they get information out, why people read what they're reading. But we are also competitors. I think we also would like to have the best science in our journal. We think what we're doing is particularly good, and in the way we disseminate our findings, in what we have to offer authors. But I think it's that sort of friendly way in which we try to make each other better, frankly, is the way I think about it. And I will say one of the most lovely weeks that I had after I was announced as the next editor-in-chief was just the editors-in-chief from other journals who reached out to me, who offered support, who invited me to their manuscript meetings. So there is a little bit of competition, of course, but there's also a lot of, there are very few people who are in exactly this situation except other editors-in-chief. And there's a nice community, and I've really appreciated that as well.
That's nice to hear. We have to talk a little bit about misinformation and the politicization of science, maybe a little bit about Twitter. and Elon. So why don't you just sort of, I'm sure you've been asked every question in that regard. Why don't you just riff on what you think the journal's role is in a world where in some ways you're competing against crazy? And you already mentioned the importance of peer review, but as this world spins ever faster and has more influence in the body politic and the way people think about everything, including healthcare stuff, how do you think that changes the nature of what you need to do?
Yeah, it's one I think about a lot. So we just published a very nice large trial of ivermectin versus placebo, and it turns out that ivermectin doesn't work for COVID. And I saw one tweet about this that said, well, if you're reading this, you already know this result, and if you're not reading this, like nothing that is in this article will convince you. Right. And it's something that I think about. So that is an important trial. We want the science to be done. We're really proud to publish that. And it's important, as starting as a scientist, it's really important that we get information out there. But then when I hear like, for example, from the medical societies, and they say, we love you all talking about evolving science, but you need to tell us when there's settled science. And we have doctors who are actually giving ivermectin or recommending ivermectin. And so can't you tell us with something more than your usual, like here's a new scientific article to say, no, this is a long line of many scientific articles that really say that ivermectin should not be used. So part of me says, well, we should be doing different types of communication about that finding. Part of me is a little bit skeptical that a traditional journal can ever communicate in a way that plays a role in this regard. And so I would say this issue is a very real one that all of us face, but what role a traditional journal plays in this sea of misinformation and disinformation, I'm not exactly sure. I do know, or at least we believe, that some of our communication on platforms like doing really great explainer videos on YouTube, doing that are accessible, that you can find and search, that you don't need a lot to get that information, that are not an hour-long video, but are a 20-minute video or 15-minute video. We do think that is part of our role in doing this, that we're at least putting out in the universe of information sources, information that could be consumed by many people on important subjects. But I think this is a dynamic area, and I have a feeling we're going to be thinking more deliberately about what we need to do in this area even more as we go on.
Yeah. It's about the most dynamic area I can think
Yes.
of, and really troubling. And you're right. I sort of feel the same way. People tell me, well, my tweets have been helpful in people kind of deciding what to do. And I say, that's nice, but I'm pretty sure the people I want to most reach are not following me. And
Yes.
the people you want to most reach are probably not reading JAMA. And
Exactly.
it's hard. That's a hard nut to crack.
I think it really is. But I do think it speaks to communicating on a bunch of different platforms, which we are fortunate to have the ability to do. And we have to figure it out a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I do think one thing, as you and I have attended some meetings about disinformation, I think one of the things that always hits home for me there is how organized so much disinformation is. And I think it does mean that those of us who are in the communication business have to be a little bit more organized in what we're doing and who our audience is that we're trying to communicate to in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I was struck a little bit, I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether it changed your thinking about the peer review process in general. You already mentioned that preprints kind of forced you to up your game in terms of the speed with which you do your thing, that in some ways you're competing against instant, and so you've got to be faster. But I was also sort of impressed by, it's not exactly peer review, but it's sort of the wisdom of crowds, that of all the preprints that came out during COVID, I can't think of many that were massively wrong. And the ones that were massively wrong got, heard about it very quickly on Twitter, and not just by, certainly by a lot of people, but often by experts, by, the kind of people that you would have called a reasonable peer reviewer for this thing. And they weighed in on Twitter, and it was sort of the wisdom of crowds meets credentialed experts doing instantaneous peer review. And I guess it seemed more effective than I would have guessed it might be 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. I do wonder about, there are two issues though that I would highlight. I do wonder about the whether the post-pandemic time, if we ever get there, translates to the pandemic time, where really you concentrated everyone's attention on the latest scientific content. There was a lot of pressure to do it. A lot of good people were on reading the preprints and commenting on the preprints and wanting to get the information out. I'm not quite sure how it translates to the whole range of problems in science and medicine and when you get to a post-pandemic state. I also would say there are people who will point out that that those articles that came out that were quickly debunked in all of those comments still played in some audience somewhere, right? And and that they're still up. And for people who don't read all the comments or understand that some finding was debunked, that whether it's ivermectin or chloroquine or whatever it is, that a lot of those have been perpetuated by the ease of publication. But in some ways, you could say. So you could say that, well, that's a problem of preprint servers. I would say there's a lot of ways in which wrong information gets started, not just preprint servers. Sure. And in fact, when I look, if I'm a drug company and I'm trying to get my information out as quickly as possible, I just do a press release. I don't even bother with a preprint server. Mm-hmm. A preprint server, at least somebody has to write a number of words with a method section, right?
But yes.
Exactly. But a lot, I think a lot of the big drug companies the way they release a scientific finding is by press release, and you don't even see then the rest of it. So I think it definitely is problematic, but they have a role to play, and I don't think they replace traditional journals, but I think I do think they have a role to play.
Yeah, and I think it's a terrific point that we shouldn't overlearn the lessons from COVID. The issue of everybody in the world cares deeply about this thing, and everybody's watching, and people have nothing else to do.
Yes.
and so, so that kind of scrutiny is not going to be true for the next article about a new treatment for scleroderma. It's just not the way the world's
yes, exactly right.
I think that makes sense. You mentioned the pharma companies. So as I think about journals that have gotten themselves in trouble over the years, it feels like sometimes it's a political misstep and sometimes it's a conflict of interest. Those seem like the two biggies. So we talk about some of the political issues and the firewall. Talk a little bit about conflicts of interest, how you balance it, whether protections need to be stronger or there's a recognition that a lot of people do have conflicts and disclosure is sort of the best we can do. How do you think about that?
I think this is a big issue. JAMA has always had a very strong policy of understanding an author's conflicts of interests, disclosing them and putting those disclosures prominently. I think our job as editors is to understand when a particular interest that an author has affects how we might consider a paper and the conclusions in a paper. And I think that's where it's hard, right? So I would say we've had a very clear process, and I think we're really proud of that process. I think the judgment calls of when an affiliation, when a funding source somehow leads one to question whether a paper should be published is the judgment call. And I would say, and I will say, even in my limited experience here already at JAMA, that sponsors have an interest in getting their papers published. They have an interest in the specific words that get published in a paper. They have an interest in specific ways in which a finding is communicated. And you can pretty quickly see why it's good to have editorial review, because and so I think the challenge then is balancing this, because, certainly in many fields, the best science is also funded by sponsors who are going to make money off of whatever product is out there as well. And so I don't think you can be in the position to say, well, we are never going to publish those types of papers. I would like us to be in the position to say, well, we understand where the money is coming from, and we think that the most responsible way to communicate about this finding is this way, and to have that out at the editorial stage. But I will say, the people who sponsor studies that have money on the line, they have an interest in almost every single word in a publication, and that's probably where the danger zones come in. Interesting.
And they let you know that they didn't like
they do.
This word you should have used that word versus this word.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And we let them know, well, we're editors. So
right, exactly.
We think these words would be better. And so I think that's where the tension is sometimes.
Sure. I'm going to spend a minute on primary care. You were a primary care doctor and have been for a long time. And it's not necessarily flowing from your new position, but you're now seeing the world from a different altitude. How are you thinking about the state of primary care? And is that something that you're going to take seriously in your role as an editor?
Yeah, I do take it seriously, and part of the reason I think it's it might be my reluctance to leave San Francisco or to have a safety net when the Chicago winter hits, but it was really important to me to continue to have my practice in San Francisco, because I think clinical work has always been the thing that's kept me grounded, even though I've spent all of my professional life mostly doing research, or so not being a full-time clinician. And I think the same is true when I think about, that new study comes out, well, how does it change what we do in practice? And probably the thing that hits me the most is just, as you know, how busy clinicians are, how busy they are, in particular during this time as we, come to this phase of the pandemic, because it's been a hard few years. How the amount of information that a primary care clinician has to be able to somehow navigate, both the medical information and then how to fill out the prior auth forms and make the referral to whatever. And then think at the end of the day from the electronic health record about, what you're going to do in documenting and everything else. That's a lot. And I do think that it makes me think differently about what are the other ways we communicate, and not just like one article, but like use the massive information that we have across the JAMA network to think with others about how information is more readily available to clinicians in a way that's useful, how we use our platform to write about leading voices and how they're thinking about what needs to change in the practice of medicine, how we think about the types of studies and the real science that's being generated, and how we use electronic health records and how we might use them better. And I think we want to be in that position to do that. That's our responsibility as a journal that's really writing for a clinical community. And that clinical community, especially the frontline primary care docs, they're really being stretched in a lot of ways. So I think it's an important area for us to be in.
Yeah. Do you see, you may not see quite as much of this at the county, but the world of patients using their portals, managing their own care, then messaging their doctors, increasingly having third-party apps that they're measuring their heart rate and their this and that, and somehow, I mean, it's just it's daunting even to think about how you would process all of this. How do you begin to think about it?
I agree. We did this wonderful series on diagnostic excellence, and which inevitably has these great perspectives on how we can use more information to get better diagnoses to patients. And as somebody who's like, when you just step into any room with a patient and you think about all of the things that they're bringing to the visit, how in the world multiple streams of information can ever be harnessed in a way that you could actually use it in the context of a very short visit. And then, we love the idea of more patient engagement. That's why I do primary care still, because of the engagement of patients in their own healthcare. But the additional streams of information that come from the many ways in which patients engage in their healthcare with all of these things is also the challenge, right? And I do think, and we've had a number of authors in JAMA write about this, and I do think this is one of those areas. I know it's one you work in quite a bit, that we're going to have to continue to figure out.
Yeah. And social determinants too, as we finally open up our eyes and say it's not just about this medical encounter and about your creatinine, but about you and your life and your circumstances. And terrific, like, how does that fit in, and where does that information come from, and how do we process it when you're already overwhelmed?
Well, and not just how we process it, because more information theoretically and in actuality is helpful, but how do we do that in a way that protects patients and protects patients across a range of types of information? How do we do that in a way that doesn't lead to the same types of cognitive biases that we sometimes have? Oh, this patient from this neighborhood, therefore that means this. And so I think I of course love data, so I start with more data is probably better, but more data has to also be studied to find out whether it really does help clinicians make decisions better, and in what ways could it make better decisions for clinicians.
And we have to pay some attention to the burden of what happens when more data just gets thrown at people.
Absolutely.
I think we saw that with alert fatigue in the early days of the electronic health record, and it's just going to get more and potentially worse if we're not really thoughtful about what's actually happening with the data.
Absolutely.
We're coming to the end. Sort of let's project 10 years in the future. You have either finished your tenure or you're 10 years into your tenure, and you're looking back and it has been a great success. What does that look like in your mind?
I have a 5-year contract, so you're already
okay. You can take it 5 years. Let's be a little less ambitious, but let's take 5 years.
Wow. I think if you and I think about what we are going to be talking about in 10 years when we do another fireside chat, I think medicine looks radically different, right? I do think we are talking about how do people get the information for how do they take care of patients? Where are people taking care of patients? There's a lot that's going to look different from here to 10 years from now. I start off as a scientist, and I love that science has moved us forward during the pandemic, has moved us forward. But there's so much in the external environment of healthcare that is not just in how we generate science, that is also pushing us to continue to shift and evolve in so many different ways, as well as the larger forces in society related to information, related to societal inequities. So I don't know where I will be in 10 years, but I do know that type of dynamic environment, being able to contribute how we communicate information to people who need to have that information to make decisions, whether it's patients or health system leaders or clinicians or scientists doing the next experiment, is a really exciting thing, because I want to be there as things are shifting and figure out how we stay relevant and continue to be part of the process of moving things forward, hopefully to an environment of more health for more people.
That would be great. And it's just really exciting to hear from you and hear how you're processing those first 4 to 6 months. And I think you're already making a difference, and I really look forward to seeing what you do during your tenure, whether it's 5, 10, or 20 years. And thanks for keeping your association with us and remaining part of the family. It's very important to us, and glad it's important to you as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And thanks for all you're doing with communicating on your platforms. And thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure. All right. Be well, stay safe, and talk to you soon.